members are hired and evaluated based on their performance in 3 areas: teaching, research, and service. Most faculty members will tell you that they went into higher education because of the opportunity to take a passion for a certain discipline and run with it. It seems fitting then that 3 of our professors whose passions intersect with Stevenson's book tell us of these interests and how they parlayed them into doing research, serving the greater good, teaching, and how all of this is reflected in the campus reading. So sit back, think about what these gifted educators have to tell us, and consider how your own passions can be, have been, or are now influenced by great teachers, great classes, and great ideas. Our first speaker is from the College of Business and Economics. Bryan McCannon is an expert in the fields of law and economics and game theory. His research is primarily in the field of law and economics, public choice, and behavioral experimental economics. He investigates the incentives and behaviors of prosecutors. He has published in journals such as Public Choice, Journal of Public Economic Theory, Contemporary Economic Policy, the European Journal of Political Economy, and the Review of Law and Economics. Let us please welcome Dr. Bryan McCannon.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. There we go. My slides. Fantastic. All right. Thank you all. I know it's Friday, right? It's raining. Good for you for coming out here in the weather. I'm here to talk about the research side of the teaching, research, and service component. And like any researcher, right, no matter what I pick up, whether it's related to research or just for leisure reading, I always see what I'm interested in, what I'm reading, right? And so when I picked up Just Mercy, right, there's a lot of themes in this book, a lot of different issues are being addressed, but I saw in it a link to my research, right? And that's why I was willing to volunteer and kind of talk about what I'm interested in. So as I was introduced, my main area of research is law and economics. Now, I teach all areas of economics, but I like using economics to study the legal system. Not a lot of people do it, which gives me something to do, right? Gives me lots of opportunities, right? Is a pretty specialized niche of economics. Most people think about things like banking or labor markets as what economists do. But I find studying the legal system through the lens of economics especially interesting. My focus has been almost exclusively on prosecutors. There's many actors involved in the legal system, judges and defense attorneys, and like Bryan Stevenson acted. But I'm focused on prosecutors a little bit. So, how did I link this book to my research, right? If you think about kind of what's underlying, obviously there's issues of race, there's issues of income that are clearly important here, and maybe a little bit about sophistication and mental health as well, right? But underlying kind of the tragedy of the book are the democratic institutions of the United States, right? We have, throughout the book, we have prosecutors who are making decisions about how to handle these individuals, whether they have mental disabilities, whether there's income constraints, whether they're having good representation. But prosecutors are making decisions on how to handle the cases that we read about. Law enforcement officers are making choices, right? And so if you think about the institutions, right, there's nothing special necessarily about the Deep South where they were operating. We have the same types of institutions in Alabama and Mississippi as we do in West Virginia and further north throughout the whole country. We have public servants engaged in activities, providing services, public goods, if you will, for all of us, the prosecution of crime, right? And so this is what I've been interested in. You might wonder, I'm interested in prosecutors, why an economist would be spending his time talking about the legal system, right? It seems like this should be something for law faculty, or maybe a sociologist or psychologist be studying. But economics has this particular way to think about the world. We like to think about the trade-offs. We like to think about the institutions and how the institutions that we're functioning in provide incentives and benefits and costs to the different actions we take. And especially when we talk about the criminal justice system, we can adjust these rules, right? We set up the rules of the game. We determined how these guys are selected for their jobs, what their objectives are, compensation, right? These are part of our governance structure, and so somebody needs to be thinking about how these institutions create the incentives, right, that these actors in the book operate within. Does that make sense? You can also think of this as, study the economics of prosecutors. You can think of it as a special area of law and economics, right? I'm sorry, I said law and economics. Special area of labor economics, right? There's a lot of jobs out there. Your typical job, as the students in the room will learn soon enough, you'll get a resume together, right? You'll be struggling to find ways to get that in the hands of hiring managers and trying to get somebody to hire you, right? I did the same thing trying to get the job here, right? I had in my resume, I had to convince a hiring committee that I was the guy to pick, right? For prosecutors, we do something very, very different. We elect them, right? They don't fill out resumes. These guys run in elections where your voters in your area pick who they are. It's a very unusual way to hire somebody for a job. It's a very different mechanism with a different set of incentives, so worth some attention. You can think about public finance and public choice. Probably nobody knows. Public choice came up a couple times what that is. Public choice is just the area of economics that says we should think about politicians and bureaucrats realistically in terms of what incentives they have, right? But public finance, prosecutors are clearly important as well, right? I'm sure you've heard about the degree of overcrowding in the prisons in the U.S., the number of people incarcerated, along with the potential sociological effects. This is also very expensive for us to do, right? We hire lots of judges and bailiffs, and we take jurors out from their work days to function the legal system, right? So there's a public financing side that makes studying prosecutors interesting as well. Okay, so what do I like about, if you think about prosecution, the economic issues that might be arising that's underlying this book, there's three things I want to kind of point out about them. One is for an economic issue that we monopolize this service, right? There's no such thing as competition between prosecutors. A county will have a prosecutor, right? That's the one that people elect. Now, there's probably good reason why we don't have competition between law enforcement to see who can get the most arrests, right? It's probably the correct way, but monopolies have disincentive effects as well, right? They don't have to respond as much to the demands of the consumers, us being consumers of protection, if there's not alternatives for us to consume, right? So it's important to think about the external incentives that prosecutors have. It's also important people to study because of the amount of discretion they have, right? I think most people, when they think about crime, they think about judges and how they can influence things, but not really in the United States, not anymore, right? We use things like sentencing guidelines and mandatory minimums, rules like this that limit the discretion of the judges for what they can do. But when we put in sentencing guidelines, so these are just restrictions on what type of punishments can be handed out. When we put these limitations on judges, then we leave all the discretion to prosecutors. They choose whether to file charges, which charges, how many charges. They choose to dismiss or to plea bargain a case. They even make sentencing recommendations when possible. We put all the discretion in these one particular actors, right? And that's just a little list of all the things that we endow them with in our system. And the magnitude of their choice is non-trivial. Obviously, as we were reading in the book, right, the choices made by the prosecutors in these cases, the choices not to reopen cases, not to consider new evidence, the original prosecution decisions, right? And it's obviously affecting the victims and their families and communities. That's what this book is about, right? But it's also affecting the accused there, the victims as well. The accused and victims are being affected, right? But their choices are also affecting all of us through the public financing, the amount of money we're spending on this system, right? And the deterrence of crime, right? Whether they're making good decisions or not, and whether or not that helps reduce the chance of someone breaking my house this weekend, right? So they make many choices. They have a lot of discretion, right? We've kind of got this monopolized system that's pretty unique. And so I find them interesting to study, right? And so how do we hold these guys accountable, right? So when we read a little bit in a book like this, we can think about how some of the things that happen there seemed a bit unfair. So how do we keep these guys accountable for their actions, right? Well, in the United States, we do something very strange. A couple things we do strange. If strange to you means different than the rest of the world, right? Which I think is a pretty good definition of strange, right? So we do two things that are very, very different from the rest of the world, right? One is we engage in something called plea bargaining, right? Plea bargaining is when we literally sit down with defensive representation, the prosecutor, and we negotiate the punishment, the number of months in jail somebody has to serve, right? This doesn't happen as much. Now, the rest of the world is starting to catch up with us. Europe's moving country by country towards more plea bargaining. But everybody seen the TV show Law and Order, right? Where they're passionately making their argument. I know it's an old show because I'm an old guy, right? So I make old references. That's the way it is. But where they're passionately making these arguments in the courtroom. Well, this is a fantasy. This is not how our criminal justice system works. It might surprise you to know that of just felonies, right, just the serious things, we plea bargain over 97% of these cases, right? Almost nobody sees the inside of a courtroom. And therefore, the role of the judge as somebody who can make sure that rules of evidence are followed, right? Make sure that coercive, untrue threats aren't being made. The basic kind of rule, the judge as umpire, can't happen if they're never in court, right? And they're just negotiating over at a table in a back office, right? The other thing that's unique about the U.S. is that I mentioned this a second ago, we elect our local prosecutors. So 95% of felony convictions in the U.S. are handled by your state local prosecutors. In 46 states, these guys are elected in popular partisan elections. I like to do this, like, who can even name who their prosecutor is in their county? Nobody knows who their prosecutor is. And you are the only accountability mechanism we have, right? They're plea bargaining, so they're doing this all on the back table, right? The only way we select and retain these guys is through popular elections by you guys casting your votes and holding these people accountable. So this is a pretty unusual system we have here in the United States. And as I think we can illustrate here in the room, your typical voter is not only do they not vote very much, voter participation is not that high, but they're not really informed about their local prosecutors. Everybody's probably got an opinion about Trump and Clinton right now, right? But you probably don't have an opinion about your local prosecutor. So how are we doing on time? Don't want to talk too long. This stuff's fun. I can talk a long time, so I got to keep a track. I only got 4 more minutes. So I've been doing a little bit of research on these guys since I have a short little period, and I can talk for a long, long time. So I'm going to skip a few things. But let me jump to here. My first foray into studying prosecutors, I was interested in how this election mechanism works. And is there a concern that the way in which we select and retain prosecutors affects how they handle the criminal justice system? So I first kind of said, well, let's think about, this is a pure theoretical paper, so it's not very fun for people who don't like equations to look at, right? But the basic idea, right, is can we think about the informational problem between rather uninformed voters and an incumbent prosecutor who knows that they at least read the newspaper and can have opinions about whether or not the guy's being overly harsh or overly soft, right? And so we just wanted to study the theoretical distortions that might arise from that. But from that paper, we went and got some data. Now, usually people nobody likes data, but I like data. People like numbers, though. They like a punchline, right? Much better. So my buddy and I, Siddhartha, a friend of mine from grad school, we took this idea to the data. North Carolina actually has fantastic data. They're the one state that actually collects and records information about the criminal justice system for the rest of us to see. So therefore, it's perfect for a guy like me to study, right? So we were studying North Carolina, and we just asked some very simple questions. We had information at every county over a 12-year period. We knew how many cases went to jury trials and how much was plea bargained, how many convictions there were. And then we can match that up with electoral data. We knew when these guys were running for election, when it was off years, whether they had challengers, so on and so forth, right? And we found some interesting things, like, for example, when your local prosecutor, at least in North Carolina, but I think this is robust around the country, when your local prosecutor is running for re-election, he or she finds himself in court a lot more. Right, about 13% is 13% is about the marginal effect of the proportion of convictions that come from jury trials bumps up when the prosecutor needs to run for re-election, and there's an extra bump up if he or she is challenged in that bid, right? And so the idea is that the courtroom might actually be serving as a form of campaigning for your local prosecutors because they know the local newspapers are probably going to be covering the big juicy case that's going on in court, right? And then we did the opposite. Well, if it really is about the campaign pressures, then we shouldn't see this in districts where there's never any contests. So we defined a county as being safe for the incumbent if there's never been a contested prosecutor election in 20 years. Seems safe to me. And those guys almost never find themselves in the courtroom, right? 17% reduction in the proportion of cases that they find in jury trials in safe districts. So my buddy and I'm doing time. I'm really bad at time, and I'm really also bad at working iPhones. There we go. My buddy and I also said, well, what other margins might be moving other than the decision of plea bargain versus take case trial? So we just simply asked, what about the case load, right? This is a big deal for the prosecutor. He's got way too much work to do, and that's part of the reason why they're plea bargaining in the first place, right? So what happens to the backlog of cases? Well, it turns out, again, looking at North Carolina, because they got fantastic data, right, that when the prosecutor's up for re-election, nothing gets processed that year. Right, they're spending their time in court, so the number of cases left pending at the end of the year grows by 7%. The rate of change grows by 77%. Right, so the backlog is growing substantially when the election time comes along. And then I said, well, that's all kind of fun and interesting, right? So I said, well, what about the accuracy? It seems like these prosecutors are getting pretty zealous at re-election time. They seem to be liking the courtroom and going after those nice, juicy sentences. Well, maybe that's not such a horrible thing if they're just putting bad guys in jail for a very long time, right? If it could be okay. Depends on the framework. So I said, let's go get some appellate data. We'll see if appellate courts think that their mistakes are being made. Now, this project's in New York. This is individual case level data. But we looked at 3,500 cases appealed in New York, upstate New York, so Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, right? And we matched it up with electoral data, see what was going on during their election, whether this was election season. What we found is that if a conviction occurred during election season, it was about 30% more likely to be the probability at which you get a reversal or modification increased by about 30% if the original conviction occurred during a prosecutor's re-election season. So some pretty, I think, interesting results, right, that maybe we should be concerned about the type of incentives that these guys are responding to. So I'm out of time. I have lots of other stuff that I think is a lot of fun. I even had a bar chart for you, but I'm out of time. So to summarize, right, yeah, I can talk for a long time about this. So this is just a little example of economics studying public institutions like criminal justice, right, and looking at the incentives of the actors and how our institutions and the way we design the rules of the game influence their behavior. So I'll stop there so I don't get hooked.
All right.
And turn it over.
I'd like to add that we are going to save questions for the end. So if you're bubbling over with questions for Dr. McCannon, hold on to those, write them down, text them into your phone, and we'll get to those after our other two speakers speak. Our second speaker is Dr. Lisa Weihman. She's an associate professor of English at West Virginia University, specializing in modern British and Irish literature. She came to West Virginia University 15 years ago after completing her PhD at New York University. Her research falls within the interdisciplinary field of Irish studies, drawing upon scholarship in history, literary studies, cultural studies, and gender studies. Professor Weihman has published essays on women's participation in Irish nationalist groups, including an essay in
Era
Ireland on Margaret Skinner's memoir, Doing My Bit for Ireland. She's also published essays on the fiction of Dorothy McArdle and Virginia Woolf. Most of her academic work addresses questions of nationalism, citizenship, and the use of historic memory and culture. She's currently at work on a book-length project about Anglo-Irish women's fiction of the Irish Revolutionary decade. She regularly teaches both graduate and undergraduate classes in Irish fiction, women's literature, and literary modernism. This semester, she is teaching English 273, contemporary fiction, which centers on the theme of justice. Please welcome Dr. Lisa Weihman.
Thank you. Oh, there it is. So this past month in my contemporary literature class, I taught Bryan Stevenson's Just Mercy, which is a little outside of my usual range of interest in teaching. If you've heard what I normally do, it's a little different than what I normally do. But in teaching contemporary literature, I was interested in thinking about issues of justice. And so I sandwiched Just Mercy between two landmarks of 20th century American literature, Harper Lee's 1960 novel, To Kill a Mockingbird, and Toni Morrison's 1987 novel, Beloved. Contemporary literature, for those of you who don't know, is a 200-level general education class, as well as a class for majors. But this semester I have 13 students, so we're very tiny, from a variety of majors. We started with To Kill a Mockingbird which is set in the fictional town of Macomb, Alabama during the 1930s. There's Harper Lee. So the novel, as many of you surely know, recounts the story, I hope many of you know, recounts the story of the unjust trial of Tom Robinson, an innocent African-American man found guilty of raping a young white woman named Mayella Ewell. Told through the eyes of its child narrator, Scout Finch, To Kill a Mockingbird gives us insight into the effects of institutional racism on white characters who must come to terms with racial injustice in their society. There's a rigid class structure in town that demands that someone like the lawyer Atticus Finch be a thought leader in his community, a voice of justice and mercy in an unjust world. Atticus knows from the first that Tom Robinson is both innocent and a dead man walking. He knows there's no hope of freeing Tom from the imperfect justice of Macomb's courts or from the violence of the town's lynch mob. The best Atticus can hope for, and the foundation of his enduring legacy as a literary character, which I have to say has been a little bit tarnished by the appearance of Go Set a Watchman, is to force those around him to think a bit longer and harder about what constitutes justice in small-town Alabama. The fact that the jury deliberates for several hours and not several minutes is seen as a victory by those close to Atticus, but no one, not even those in the Black community who wait patiently for justice in the courtroom, are surprised by the outcome. Atticus tells his children, there's something in our world that makes men lose their heads. They couldn't be fair if they tried. In our courts, when it's a white man's word against a black man's, the white man always wins. They're ugly, but those are the facts of life. The one place where a man ought to get a square deal is in a courtroom, be he any color of the rainbow, but people have a way of carrying their resentments right into a jury box. To Kill a Mockingbird treats the problem of institutional racism as an inevitability. Atticus knows he's going to lose the case, knows that Tom Robinson will die, and understands that he will pay a social penalty for having defended an innocent black man in an unjust system. To Kill a Mockingbird is also a coming-of-age story, highlighting the moral development of the young Scout Finch. But it's also a failed white savior story, and its enduring popularity suggests that white readers in particular are wedded to that romanticized narrative of noble failure. Atticus will fight the good fight, he will lose, but perhaps our children will grow up to be less racist, more class conscious, and incrementally the world will become a better place. As the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. declared in 1965, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, a quote that Bryan Stevenson is also fond of. To Kill a Mockingbird is a book designed to make readers feel less guilty about their own inaction through our identification with Atticus and Scout and the other characters, as though our hearts are in the right place. It's a narrative of its moment, certainly of 1960, one that can romanticize the racist Mrs. DuBose as, quote, the bravest woman I know, in Atticus's words, for beating her morphine addiction before dying, but also a narrative that locates the injustice that kills Tom Robinson, destroys his family, and devastates his black community safely in the Depression-era past. Already by 1960, white readers can see in To Kill a Mockingbird a congratulatory tale of injustice conquered in the redemption story of Arthur Boo Radley, who was granted the mercy denied to Tom Robinson when the local sheriff chooses not to indict him for the murder of Bob Ewell, the despicable man who beat and raped his own daughter and blamed it on Tom. Boo Radley is free to retreat back into the shadows of his family home, redeemed in the eyes of the Finch children, while Tom Robinson dies in a hail of gunfire trying to escape from prison. Justice for Boo will never be justice for Tom, who was always already beyond such mercy in a town like Macomb. The 30 years between the novel's setting and the publication of the novel in 1960 allow readers to engage in the fantasy that the bad old days of Depression-era racism are in the past. But 1960 is also the year that saw 4 black students from the North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College begin a sit-in at a segregated Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. And it was also the year that marks the founding of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which brought black students into the fight for civil rights. Although timid in its call to social activism, To Kill a Mockingbird touched a nerve with the reading public in 1960 and won for Harper Lee the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1961. It remained on the bestseller list for 80 weeks, was translated into 40 languages, and sold 40 million copies, making it one of the best-selling books of the 20th century, globally. It was also famously adapted into an Academy Award-winning film in 1962, starring Gregory Peck as Atticus Finch. The novel continues to sell millions of copies a year. Reading To Kill a Mockingbird today, it's easy to see why the story was so popular with contemporary audiences and why it remains popular, honestly. It reassures its readers that the world is changing, bending toward justice, but slowly, through the actions of thoughtful, educated white men like Atticus Finch, which should trouble us a bit. The actual social upheaval of the civil rights movement, the boycotts, marches, bombings of black churches, the beatings and executions of activists are nowhere to be found in Mockingbird's Maycomb. That town is a fictionalized Monroeville, Alabama, the birthplace of Harper Lee, and following To Kill a Mockingbird in my class with Bryan Stevenson's Just Mercy reinforced for my students that the arc of the moral universe is still bending, but has not yet arrived at justice. Walter McMillian was a black man unjustly tried and convicted for the murder of Rhonda Morrison in 1986, a young white woman who worked for a Monroeville, Alabama dry cleaner. Bryan Stevenson's book is structured around McMillian's long search for justice, interwoven with other stories of men, women, and children unjustly punished primarily for being poor and black in America today. Bryan Stevenson is well aware of the cultural power of To Kill a Mockingbird, and the first chapter of Just Mercy is titled Mockingbird Players. He notes with some irony that Walter McMillian, whose story resembles that of Tom Robinson, had never heard of the book. Walter's extramarital, interracial romance with a troubled young white woman is the root cause of the catastrophe that ultimately lands him on death row, as many of you know if you've read the book. As Stevenson writes, for over a century, law enforcement officials in many Southern communities absolutely saw it as part of their duty to investigate and punish black men who had been intimate with white women. Tom Robinson's pity for Mayella Ewell and her desperate desire for affection are what lead to Tom Robinson's death in Mockingbird. Walter McMillian's story is equally convoluted and outrageous, as clear proof of his innocence in the murder is ignored by law enforcement, juries, and judges. Scapegoated for the crime on the shaky testimony of a career criminal, Walter McMillian was sentenced to death row because the presiding judge in the case, Robert E. Lee Key, Jr., was allowed under Alabama law to change the jury's recommendation from a life sentence to the death penalty. The outrageous nature of the injustices leveled against the innocent Walter brought him into contact with Bryan Stevenson and the Southern Prisoners Defense Committee. And the story of Walter McMillian's incarceration on death row and his exoneration 6 years later suggests that justice and mercy can be found for black Americans caught up in the epidemic of mass incarceration, but only at great cost. Unlike Tom Robinson, Walter survives his time on death row, but Walter's incarceration cost him his livelihood, his home, his community, and his health. In an effort to build community among my students and force them to engage directly with the recent history recorded in Just Mercy, I assigned small groups individual sets of chapters. Some of you students are probably familiar with that method of doing things. Students would read and report on the assigned chapters during group presentations to the class, offering discussion questions and additional resources for further reading. Overall, they did a good job with these chapter summaries, but did a less good job at stimulating discussion. They got a taste for what it's like to try and lead a class discussion. For our final days with Just Mercy, I gave them a list of quotations from the book and a set of questions, hoping to spark more meaningful discussion. I was a little frustrated with them. So here are some of the questions that I gave them. It was about how your education up to that point, how you had learned about those things. I asked them how the book had influenced or changed their thinking, if it had, what their thoughts were on the death penalty in particular. And then I asked them how might we, as the lucky minority of people who are privileged to have access to higher education, work towards solving these problems. Overall, my students were reticent to engage with the wider social implications of Stevenson's book. No one wanted to talk about racial politics. Those who did speak seemed exhausted by the topic. And I tried not to use my classroom as a bully pulpit, but I did share my own thoughts on these issues, trying to get them started. I told them it was clear from the statistics in the book that we were executing innocent people along with the guilty, and that the only system in which it would be fair to have the death penalty was one where humans never make mistakes. Just Mercy shows us that humans do make mistakes, and sometimes intentional bad actions, and therefore we could never have true justice in a system that allows the government to kill people. I also said that I understood the emotional satisfaction of wanting evil people to die for their crimes, although our ongoing discussions about mitigation called into question how one could determine if someone was evil. In a class of 11 white students and 2 international students from Asia, there seemed to be a real fear of saying the wrong thing. So rather than highlighting white privilege as a significant factor in our understanding of racial injustice, in our majority but not exclusively white or exclusively American classroom, I chose instead to focus on the privilege that comes with education in that final question. This helped to open up the discussion a bit. So this was their ideas about being an ally. One student said that we have an obligation to talk about these issues, a statement I found a little ironic given how silent they had been up to that point. And she said, and we shouldn't back down from hard topics. And I said, yes, especially here in a university setting where we should be able to talk about hard things and ask hard questions. Another student brought up social media as a vehicle for change, but was challenged about it by other students. Social media can be an echo chamber, they said, where people preach to the choir. And I was a little surprised by their skepticism about social media and by the overall sense that there's compassion fatigue among those who use it. We talked about the problem of quietly unfollowing people when they post racist memes or jokes, rather than challenging racism when we encounter it. And we also talked about the difficulty of being an ally and how to use whatever privilege we possess to help but not dominate discussions about race. One of the international students, a young man from China, offered the observation that there is no perfect justice in this world, but that we should always keep striving for it anyway. And so we ended on a fairly optimistic note. One of the major goals of that day's class was to highlight what Stevenson calls the 4 institutions in American history that have shaped our approach to race and justice, but remain poorly understood. And these are slavery, the terrorism that followed the war, the Civil War, Jim Crow laws, and mass incarceration, as we've been talking about. I knew that we would be reading Toni Morrison's Beloved, and that looking at the history of slavery and the history of terrorism against the Black community in that novel would allow us to continue our discussion of these issues. Beloved, and there's Toni Morrison, as many of you know, is the story of Setha, an escaped slave woman who, after 28 days in freedom, is caught by the slave catchers and attempts to kill her children and herself, rather than return to slave life on the plantation. She succeeds in killing one of her children, the toddler, Beloved, who literally and figuratively haunts the narrative. The novel is a gorgeously written, terrifying, and honest depiction of the devastating costs of slavery and its repercussions through the generations. Family life, mother love, marriage, community values, and self-worth are all warped by the dehumanizing impact of slavery. The questions Bryan Stevenson's Just Mercy raises about mitigation, about community values, and the foundations of justice in our nation were revisited in our class discussions of Setha's incarceration, her isolation, and her search for absolution in Beloved. Morrison's idea of rememory haunts the former slaves and also our nation, and the book suggests that the trauma of slavery remains the rememory that Americans must experience if we are to understand the injustices that continue to haunt us. Setha tells Denver, her surviving daughter, that rememory is a thought picture, a kind of traumatic flashback, but even more than that. Where I was before I came here, that place is real. It's never going away. That's how come I had to get all my children out, no matter what. Denver, picking at her fingernails, if it's still there, waiting, that must mean that nothing ever dies. Setha looked right in Denver's face. Nothing ever does, she said. As the columnist Charles Blow wrote in the New York Times last fall, slave labor helped establish the prosperity of this country, and he argues that Black people have been, quote, systematically excluded from the full benefits of that prosperity for generations. Immersed in our analysis of Beloved, my students and I could better understand some of this complex history because we now knew people, Morrison's brilliant, suffering, damaged characters, who had lived this reality, and these insights are Morrison's gifts to the nation. Pairing both To Kill a Mockingbird and Beloved with Bryan Stevenson's Just Mercy was my attempt to show how our culture absorbs and reflects the difficult history of racial injustice, and asked that my students consider, if only for a month, their own engagement in these issues. Thank you. Those are my slides.
Moving right along here. Our next speaker, Dr. Katy Ryan. is an Everly Distinguished Professor of Teaching and an Associate Professor of English at West Virginia University. She teaches courses in 20th century American literature and drama. She has received the Neil S. Buckaloo Social Justice Award, the WVU Foundation Outstanding Teaching Award, and the Everly Outstanding Teaching Award. She is the founder of the Appalachian Prison Book Project, a nonprofit that sends free books to people in prison in 6 states and facilitates book clubs in 2 federal prisons. In 2012, she edited a collection of writings on the death penalty, Demands of the Dead, Executions, Storytelling and Activism in the United States. Please welcome Dr. Katy Ryan.
In the 1990s, my friend Ronaldo Hudson was living under a death sentence. If during those years someone had suggested I start a book club in a prison, I would have looked at them from a distant planet. A book club in a prison, that's where they kill people. When I tried to read academic or imaginative writing on imprisonment, I felt sick, felt bile rising in my throat. Something inside of me wanted to burn out. The distance between that place and that prose was bright madness. A grandmother called Bryan Stevenson to ask for help. Her 14-year-old grandson, Charlie, had been arrested. She pleaded on the phone. He's already been in the jail for 2 nights, and I can't get to him. I can't get to him. It's one of the most important lines in Just Mercy for me. To be locked up means the people who love you, care about you, cannot get to you. They cannot protect you. They can't even know what is happening to you. It is a fearsome responsibility to lock a person in a cage. What is it to lock 2 million people in cages? After the uprising and massacre at Attica in 1971, the U.S. began an incarceration campaign unprecedented in world history. By the end of the 1990s, we were building a new prison approximately every 10 days. Behind me is a visual collaboration between an artist and a GIS analyst. It shows 200 years of prison construction, federal and state prisons, in 10 minutes. So you'll want to look for the red dots. The red dots indicate a new prison built after 1980, and you'll see the speed at which the red dots appear. I am a literary scholar who has spent a decade looking at numbers. I used to think if I could find the right graph or statistic, the perfect color-coded map, we could all look at it and we would see the same thing. But no matter how staggering the numbers, how clear the racial disparities, how devastating the wrongful convictions, how endless the fatal shootings by police, this historic turn toward militarized policing and extreme punishment has been largely unrecognized for what it is, a human rights catastrophe. And so in a conversation, if I mention a person in prison, the first question I am typically asked is, what did she do? Why is she in prison? And I think of W.E.B. Du Bois, who was so often asked, what does it feel like to be a problem? Du Bois, who noticed in 1903 that when it came to the so-called Negro problems of lynchings, convict leasing, and segregation, white Americans tended to, quote, stand aside as critical and rather pessimistic spectators. I can't answer the question of why someone is in prison. To provide a legal reason, possession, theft, assault, is to cede everything I know about who ends up in prison and who does not. As Dwayne Betts writes in his memoir, once you begin explaining things to a judge, you're already short. To the question of why someone is in prison, I always want to say this, because we have lost our mind. Because the U.S. has criminalized addiction, spent over $1 trillion on a drug war with guns drawn and no discernible impact on drug usage, criminalized poverty, homelessness, mental illness, because transgendered and gender nonconforming people are especially vulnerable to arrest and conviction, because prison is one way to disappear a surplus population, and the Corrections Corporation of America eats the numbers for breakfast. Because we have betrayed the fullness of time and do not allow for change or growth, because we do not see the massive suffering, we only see the nightly news, and I know the news is bad. I'm not saying that every person in prison is innocent or locked up for a nonviolent offense. I'm not saying every police officer or prosecutor is corrupt, or academic for that matter. Universities are also entangled in this mess. These are structural, institutional problems. I am saying there is no way to cage 2 million people humanely, and that there are lives being stolen. And I am listening to Du Bois. The burden belongs to the nation, and the hands of none of us are clean if we bend not our energies to righting these great wrongs. In the 3 days between a child's arrest and an attorney's visit, while a grandmother tried to get to her grandson, Charlie was raped repeatedly. How easily he might never have told anyone, but he told Stevenson and sobbed in his arms for an hour. Moving and heartbreaking, this scene is not a surprise. Rape in prison is, and I cannot say this phrase slowly enough, a known consequence of sentencing. The number of sexual assaults, according to the federal government, about 200,000 a year, confirms Dwayne Betts' sense of things at 16 and sentenced as an adult. I lived in a world that had given up on sanity. For more on this environmentally instigated sexual violence, I encourage you to read Yvonne Hammond's essay, PhD student in the English program, in the new collection, Feminist Perspectives on Orange is the New Black. There may be no justice, but there is a justice movement. The Free Alabama movement has coordinated the largest prison strike in U.S. history across 20 states, and it is ongoing. In at least one prison, correctional officers also refuse to work. People are organizing at great risk to be heard. If you do not know the work of Jim Nolan, my colleague in sociology, who was a police officer for 13 years, you will want to Google Jim Nolan, How Policing Fails Neighborhoods and Cops. Jim argues that we need to reorient policing away from law enforcement and toward healthy and safe neighborhoods. We have to change the structure or the rules of the game. The through line of Just Mercy is an innocent case, but the heart for me are the stories of teenagers and adults sentenced to life without parole for violent acts they did commit. Stevenson brings into focus a reign of retaliation, of retribution. This departs from so much of death penalty abolitionist work that leans on and legitimizes life without parole as an alternative to death. Stevenson is clear, life without parole is the other death penalty, and neither is acceptable. I know every harrowing detail of the worst thing my friend Ronaldo ever did, but to learn why he is in prison now, 33 years later, we'd have to look at ourselves, not at him. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Appalachian Prison Book Project, and my thanks to Lydia, who is helping with the technology. Lydia, if you would scroll to the end of that, can you do that so we could just see what it looks like by the end? Is that possible? So you're seeing the red dots. So we're in the post 1980 here. If it won't move, that's perfectly fine. And if you just want to, can you find the cursor to scroll it forward? That's perfectly fine. So this is, the artist's name is Paul Rucker, and the person who did the mapping with all of the data, her name is Rose Heyer. So with those names, you can go and find that on YouTube. 10 minutes and 46 seconds, 200 years. I teach classes on literature by imprisoned and formerly imprisoned people. From my first prison studies class in 2004 grew the Appalachian Prison Book Project, an all-volunteer nonprofit with 2 realms of activity, as Susan told you. We send books to people imprisoned in 6 states, and we facilitate book clubs in a federal prison. So here's how the first part of that works. People in prison write letters asking for reading materials, and volunteers find a match from shelves of donated books. I tell people one of the best ways to learn about prison is to go into one, but another really good way is to read all of these letters. We get requests for books on gardening, good parenting, how to write poetry, how to draw, do woodwork, car repair. Letters ask for Native American history, world history, to reread Harry Potter. They need more African American literature, Chinese philosophy. One person wrote, "I only want books on West Virginia history." The most requested book is a dictionary. Will you please send me a dictionary with a zillion words in it? I'm 60 years old and have been in prison 23 years with life to go, but I can read even the smallest print. You'll see on slides artwork we receive, beautiful sketches on envelopes. We get about 100 letters every week and have mailed over 19,000 books. In the English department, we get pretty blasé about literature anthologies. They end up sort of piling up in our offices, or we use them as doorstops. But one of my favorite responses from someone in a West Virginia prison was this: I was really surprised to receive that last book you sent me, the Norton Anthology of American Literature, Volume 2. That book is the best book that I've received in my 5 years at Huttonsville. I'll treasure it for many years to come. Inspired by these letters and convinced of education's central role in freedom struggles, we started a book club in the women's unit at Hazleton Correctional Center 3 years ago. And this summer, we started a second book club at a men's prison. The book clubs meet every other week to discuss literature and share writing. I'm unspeakably grateful to staff at Hazleton who go beyond the call and fortunate to work with phenomenal volunteers who make this happen. With men and women inside, we are creating an educational and, I hope, liberating space for all of us. Our meetings have become, in one member's words, a catalyst for friendships and conversations throughout the compound. And the Women's Book Club, they may be the only people in the country who have read To Kill a Mockingbird, Go Set a Watchman, and Just Mercy. Both book clubs read Just Mercy, and in a minute I'm going to invite Valerie Surratt, an English PhD student and APBP intern, to read responses from a few of the men. One of the women, Celeste, wanted to share this. I loved how Stevenson just rolled up his sleeves. I cried for 3 days after reading Just Mercy. Afterwards, I did my part by passing it on. Amid all the prison data and controversy, there is consensus on one matter. Education significantly reduces recidivism. We have 30 years of data crunched in every conceivable way, and the findings are consistent. Education helps people stay out of prison, it improves chances for employment, and it saves money. Beyond post-release outcomes, APBP believes that education is a human right and it extends to those who may never leave. I never wanted to bring books in a prison. I wanted my friend out, the walls down. Ronaldo reminds me all the time, all of us are none. APBP continues to grow and to do this necessary work because so many people bring their hope, passion, and skills into a room. I encourage you, if you're interested, to get involved and learn with us. For more information, I'm going to shout out to Avery Williamson. Identify yourself. This young man here has materials, sign-up sheet for our listserv. I want to thank Lydia Welker for her phenomenal tech assistance. Thanks to Susan and Avery for organizing, for all of your hard work. And to the committee for choosing Just Mercy, and of course for all of you for being here. Thank you so much. So Valerie will come up and finish our panel. Oh yeah. We knew that was going to happen.
Hi, my name is Valerie, and I have the privilege to be a part of a men's book club at Hazleton Prison. The 15 incarcerated men in our group, 13 of whom are Black, are avid readers and deep thinkers dedicated to finding real solutions to the problems exposed in Just Mercy. We chose Just Mercy as our first reading, and the men's intense, personal, and visceral reactions to the book have set the tone for our bi-monthly meetings. Many in our group struggled with a sense of hopelessness while reading these all too familiar stories. However, the men find hope in the book's ability to force all readers to confront uncomfortable truths about the systems shaping our lives. As these three responses reflect, the men in our group are hungry for opportunities to contribute to social justice movements now, from the inside, and they are grateful to Stevenson for vicariously speaking for them. As one man put it, "This book has given me a voice, and what the imprisoned need is more voices." Working with these men is a gift and an honor, and I wish you could hear their voices. Jesse. When Mr. Stevenson talked about To Kill a Mockingbird, it touched home. I remember watching the movie and thinking about how great a job the lawyer did. That was a good feeling kind of movie for me. And then I read in this book, The Truth. I was shocked at how easily I could be trapped into a belief system that was directed by the movie. Instead of looking deeper, I took what I saw at face value and let my perceptions follow suit. I believe as a society, we correlate wrong with punishment. If we aren't punished or something bad doesn't come from it, then is it still wrong? We all know the answer, but how many of us live by that answer? We are so hell-bent on punishing that we have lost our purpose as Americans to help each other. We have allowed victimization to justify the victimization of others. Jonas. This book is a wonderful testimony to the strength, courage, and perseverance of the human spirit. It is sad and disturbing. It is inspiring and victorious. It is a demonstration of how devilish men and women can be when we fall victim to the dictates of the lower self, and how godly we can be when we are operating in harmony with the faculties of the higher self. Unfortunately, we have a criminal justice system that is based on racism, discrimination, and prison for profit. And this book is a painful illustration of this fact. However, regardless of how angry and offended I am by the facts of this book, I refuse to be defeated and broken. I choose to be inspired by the life of Walter McMillan post-incarceration. He was pro-social and civically active in his efforts toward criminal justice reform. If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. This book has moved me to be a part of the solution, and I hope it will move other readers to do the same. And finally, Antonio, our poet. Though we black folk have been oppressed, compressed, suppressed, stressed, and are often provoked by the calligraphy of life's unbridled abuse to exercise the exorcism of enough is enough. Enough is never enough until we become morally conscious enough to know and understand the difference and break the cycle. Just Mercy is not just a book, but in my humble, honest opinion, it's the beginning of a new movement. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had a dream, and through Just Mercy, you, Bryan Stevenson, have awakened a lot of people. I admire all of the work you're doing, and I just want you to know that your labor is not in vain. Thank you.
All right. Well, we've certainly had learned some provocative things tonight, some different things. My question is, what questions do you have for our panelists? Do we have anybody? Over here, yes, Sawyer.
Do you four know about the use of segregation in modern America? It's not nearly as bad as it was, say, 50 years ago, but it's like they have color-specific proms and minor things like that. It's also socially unacceptable to have mixed relationships in many parts of the world.
Okay, so does anybody want to comment on things like segregated proms or the way that you perceive, or maybe your students perceive, or your research has perceived this sort of segregation, or how it may work in the prison system to your knowledge?
It's a good question. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what, let's come back to that one.
Yeah, I'm thinking,
Let's think
yeah.
about it. Who else has a question? Yes.
For the gentleman, I just wanted him to discuss a little bit of prisons for profit.
Yeah. So I have to begin with an admission, right? That the economics of the prison system is a pretty vibrant literature, right? A lot of you were even mentioning the data. We like data, and something we play with. We like to do. But I have not done much with imprisonment. From what I understand, that maybe there might be fewer of those than we had before. But I'm not sure. The question is like, what's the value of having market competition in something like a prison, right? in general, you hope what markets do, right, for the for-profit thing, right, is help direct the allocation of resources, right, and try to get some entrepreneurial activity and innovation, right. And it's not clear that I'm not sure how that would express itself in for-profit prisons, right? Because it's not as if the people who are receiving the services, if you want to use that, we have our own terms, right? The people who are receiving the services aren't the payers, right? So it's not like you're finding a better system for the inmates, right? Because they're not choosing by definition. So I'm not 100% sure what the objective is, right, of for-profit prisons. So I don't have an answer. I don't know.
I can speak to the question of how many. So it's about 7%, I think, of all prisons are private. So most of them are not private prisons. The federal government has just banned private prisons in their system, but that's a much smaller system than the state system, so that doesn't actually impact most of the private prisons. And the other piece of this in terms of profit motivation within the system, and we do have to keep an eye on private prisons because as state budgets get crunched, it becomes a kind of solution, right? So if the state can't pay for its incarceration policies, then a private prison corporation is there to say, well, we can help you out with that. You give us the money, we'll do it more efficiently. Well, one way to make that profit motive would be then to cut some of those services like medical care or decent food. So the federal government has decided that those privately run prisons are too dangerous. They're having too many problems in them, and that was the reasoning behind deciding to eliminate them. But the other thing we have to remember is that even in publicly run prisons, there's lots of private interests. So the phone calls, the food service, the medical care is usually is contracted with a private, company. So, and particularly phone companies have made exorbitant, profit off of communication between people inside and their family members or friends. Yeah.
I know I'm originally from Preston County, and everybody was happy when the prison was put there because there would be jobs, which I don't think is the way that you're supposed to look at it, but it speaks a lot to the poverty of Preston County.
Absolutely.
But also, I want to also throw out there just one of my colleagues, and I don't know a whole lot about this, but one of my colleagues in the marketing department at WVU teaches a class, we have a whole program of sustainable marketing, and she has a student who's actually doing a research project on rewarding private prisons who show an increased lack of recidivism.
Recidivism. We know what you're saying. Yeah.
It's our tough word.
So if you run a private prison and the people who leave the prison go out and seem to be better more able to adapt to the world outside and less inclined to commit another crime, then you would be incentivized, which I think is kind of an interesting way to look at it. Unfortunately, I don't think that's what private prisons are like at all right now. That's just kind of a utopian thing for the future. So. Yes?
Dr. McCannon, can you comment on the salary of a prosecutor versus, even like so apples to apples, maybe an hourly rate that the prosecutor may earn, the number of hours the prosecutor may work, and then the court-appointed lawyers for the defendants and what they're making?
Sure. Yes, so I have been investigating a little bit more in West Virginia. So what I can tell you from just kind of survey of prosecutor offices across the country is I think they're paid pretty poorly. Public defenders are paid worse, right? I think most people treat both jobs, whether it's the defense side or the prosecution side. I think a lot of the typical path as a law student treat that as an entry-level job. There actually is empirical evidence, right, that if private law market salaries are higher in an area, that the junior prosecutors in offices are more likely to take cases to trial because they view it as resume building, right? And they're more likely to get better job offers after a few years of trial experience, right? In terms of West Virginia, I know Mon County that we live in does not have a public defender office. It uses something called panel attorneys, which are lists. We're about 50-50 in the state here of whether we have a public office or not. And I think it's something like $45 an hour is what the the assigned counsel receives if they're doing indigent defense, right? If it's someone of higher income, they can charge whatever they want, right? And then they cap how many hours they're allowed to work. So there's a cap on, well, they can work as many hours as they want. There's a cap on how many hours they can charge.
Since many of the people in this room are used to working minimum wage, $45 an hour might sound like a lot. Can you compare that to how much an attorney in a private firm?
Yeah, I don't know what that would be, but I do know that the top law firms are over $1,000 an hour.
An hour.
There were some Philadelphia firms that were charging more than $1,000 an hour.
Yeah. The actual attorney doesn't see that much, but
Well, that has to cover a lot of support staff as
it's
well.
still a lot more than any of us know.
Yeah.
Okay.
$45 an hour for the defense.
Yeah.
Right, what's a prosecutor per hour? Or
So they're going to be salaried. So the prosecuting in West Virginia, the prosecuting attorney's office and the counties that have public defender offices are going to be salaried positions. So I know typical for rule. I don't know exactly like Mon County's salaries. Typically, entry level salaries will be between $30,000 and $40,000 a year for someone who has law school debts.
I can answer the question about
Yeah.
private firms. It's between $200 and $450 an hour for suburban private practice.
Okay.
Pennsylvania, 45 minutes.
I know that some prosecutor offices work out deals with the lower ranked law schools. So like in Cook County in Chicago, they got a deal with Roosevelt College, which I'd never heard of, that all their law students move straight into Cook County prosecutor office for the first couple years before they go get new jobs. And then they pay off their law school debts.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. Who has it? Yes.
This Maybe you can answer it. Where do you think you should really draw the line in the sand? Which problem do you think we should address first when you're trying to combat systematic oppression inside any institution, whether that be the law or justice system or whatever? Is it education or is it information? Do you just throw information at people or do you try and educate them holistically first? Because the latter takes a lot more time and may not even be feasible. I don't know. What do you guys think?
It's a good question. What I found in talking to my students is that so many of them hadn't been educated on any of the history of race relations or of slavery or of really just sort of basic American history. About half the class had a lot. And so it was really interesting to see how uneven that was. And so I think what you're saying is that, this, if I'm hearing you right, this idea of like giving people information as opposed to more systematic methods of education, is that sort of your question?
I guess, how do you solve the problems that we face
Yeah.
as Americans that are equipped to even think about them?
I'm not sure. I think the more you expose people to real people's stories and fictional stories as well. I mean, I think the stories that people tell of the past, I think then you're able to sort of relate. I think that when you can relate as a human being to another human being, then you can change things, right? Then you can understand the things that motivate or the things that matter. So I do think, I think that education matters in changing people and changing people's hearts and minds about things. But I don't know. I'm not sure about in some ways, we get a huge amount of information from Bryan Stevenson's Just Mercy. If that was the only thing you were going to read about these situations, then it could be very valuable. But I'm not entirely sure that I see the distinction. Think about that. Do you have an idea about it? I don't think there are any easy solutions to any of these problems. Yeah.
What do you think are some of the more effective tools in educating people on a mass level? I guess it's like more to the point question.
Okay, that's a good one.
Yeah, I really appreciate this question. I think about this a lot, and that was part of why I started with, I keep thinking if I can just show it, like everyone will see it, like they'll see that can't be right. But that doesn't work. So I don't think information does dive deep enough. And so I think it's the harder road that you mentioned. And if prison history teaches us anything, it's the way in which we can keep reproducing a system of exploitation and violence, right? That information, and a lot of that has been driven by sort of information and by a lot of academic information, right? So, and we haven't really transformed those structures and those institutions. We haven't we haven't finished Reconstruction in my mind, right? That we never truly created those democratic organizations that needed to appear to fully liberate, our country 150 years ago. So, yeah, so for me, education is a piece of it. And I think that thinking about multiple sites for education, not just formal classrooms, but a kind of dedication, to community education and to educating ourselves and slowing down, maybe, to see if our principles are aligning with our actions, right? So that the human story, I think, can be very motivating and very inspiring, but To Kill a Mockingbird is a very emotional story. It's, but that's also the trap. So I think that, like Frederick Douglass always said, forget the humanity narrative, just get the chains off, right? I mean, that was basically what Frederick Douglass kept saying, just get the chains off. So if you believe in democracy, if you believe in freedom, if you believe in health, and you believe in safety, and we're not producing those outcomes, then we need to go back to, to Bryan's point, we need to really rethink what are the outcomes of our institutions and our organizations, are we meeting them? And I think just on a very human level, that's also true. We have these principles, but we don't meet up with them every day, right? We fail, and that's part of being human, but we really have to hold public institutions accountable to those principles.
I would add that, just an add-on point, right, that I know you could be pessimistic, right? But in a few dimensions, like our views on drugs and capital punishment, if you take a long enough time period, I think we have a pretty radically different view than, say, 20 years ago about these things, right? I think if I talk to undergraduate students in class about capital punishment or what do they think about legalization of marijuana, it's not the same discussion as in the 90s, right? You know what I mean? Like, I think those are two dimensions where we've had decades of people talking about the war on drugs, the way capital punishment is handled, that you see states leaving capital punishment, right, slowly but surely. So maybe there is some value in just driving home the points for a long time.
All right, well, I would, before we end, I would like to say that if you are here with a forensics class, Dr. Weihman will meet with you over there afterwards. If you are here with my class, come over here and you can pick up the form. But I think that all of our
Finding things from someone who is.
So you're going to ask me next. So let's
all over.
Oh, no.
Irish. Thank you.